Welcome. This is Michael Gillette, Burning Champion High School. We are going to address the Federalist Era. This is 1789-1801 AP U.S. history. So first of all, I want to go ahead and give thanks to Jim Smith, a great professional historian, and in helping provide for me much of the content that will be covered in this video. It's a byproduct of an AP Special Topics seminar that I attended in 2014. Also want to thank Dr. Mattisau from Rice University for also helping to contribute to my knowledge on the content from this particular unit. So moving on, so we're going to look at the Federalist Era. And what is the Federalist Era? So the Federalist Era begins with the ratification of the Constitution and the election of George Washington as the first president of the United States. That's 1789. Okay, we've got a brand new Constitution. We've gone through a very contentious ratification process throughout the states. And of course, the period is going to end with the election and inauguration of the first Republican president, Thomas Jefferson. So the Federalist Era is an analysis of the presidencies of both George Washington and John Adams. And so the Federalist Era, as it says, is the period of U.S. history noted for the first two presidents who we refer to as Federalists. And it's a time period where the political ideology of Alexander Hamilton is really going to take hold in the national government. So let's think about what America was like in 1789, right? Let's think about what that's like. The country was young. We're a new republic, population 3.9 million, and with by the end of the period, the population is almost going to double. Well, not nearly, but 5.3 million, 1800. So we're a rapidly growing country. We're not very densely populated. We're a very young country because we're growing very quickly. Life expectancy is 36 years old. Slave population, just under 700,000 in 1789, and it's going to rise to almost 900,000 in just a decade. So slavery is expanding. We enter the new government under the Constitution. The United States is drowning in debt. 11 million in change in foreign debt, 40 million domestic. That's money that we owe ourselves. The federal government owes itself. And of course, the states, the combined debt of the states, 25 million people. So we're importing 87% of manufactured goods in the United States are imported from Great Britain. So we're still having to deal with that. Per capita income in 1790 is $437 a year, and which is down from the year of independence, 1776. So we are in the midst of an economic depression, a continued economic depression in 1789. Most Americans are farmers. 90% of Americans were farmers, and the United States is going to be in a really dangerous place, right? And so it's a lot like the critical period, where we're in a pretty precarious situation, both economically and national security and foreign policy. Domestic insurrection is still a real threat to the republic, and as it says here, the nation was indeed fragile. So this is what the country looks like in 1790. We got developed territories in the West, and we got Europeans all around, right? We got the British in Canada. You've got Louisiana at this time is part of Spain. It will eventually exchange hands. You got the Spanish also in Florida and West Florida and throughout much of the Southwest. So in addition, I mean, I guess one of the, looking at the United States physically, we're completely engulfed and surrounded either by water or by Europeans All right. So the Federalist era, a new national culture and new political institutions were in its infancy, trying to develop despite the passions of sectionalism, party division, and class conflict. And so basically, in the midst of the economic hardships and the foreign policy challenges and the possibility of insurrection, we see a new American culture develop. We've got a new government under the Constitution. So we have new political institutions that were brand spanking new, and making situations a little bit more tense is the passions of sectionalism. All right, sectionalism is essentially loyalty to your section of the country. So if you come from the South, or if you come from the New England, or if you are from the West, that's your section. So anytime you see sectionalism, it's referring to rivalries between various regions, party divisions. Of course, the Federalist era, we're going to see a very sharp, rigid two-party system emerge between the Federalists on one hand and the Republicans on the other. And of course, class conflict. We're going to continue to have issues between, rich and poor, the elites, and the common man. So a source of strength and unity was needed if the new government and the new nation was going to endure, and this came in the form of George Washington. So George Washington is very well known by this point, is going to be the glue that's going to hold the early republic together, his leadership. Okay, so as we go through this, I want you to think about to what extent was George Washington a great president? What did he, we want to have a real honest, sober assessment as to what extent was Washington a great president. So I am going to skip these quotes. I highly recommend. I want you guys to make sure you read, especially the highlighted portions. Okay, you have access to this PowerPoint, but let's move it. But I want to expedite this a little bit. So the importance of George Washington. Why is he important to the story? And it's very simple that from 1754 until his death in 1799, George Washington was at the center of almost every significant event in American history. Not on the periphery. He wasn't an outlier. He was never an outlier. He was in the center of almost every significant event. The extent to which someone thinks he's a great leader depends on personal ideas about the importance of the United States in human history. So kind of give an overview of his life. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. This is something I normally spend in class talking about Washington's life prior to the French Indian War and beyond. But as you can see, these are important phases of his life. Being the British officer in the French Indian War, who participated in essentially the first battle between the French and the British. So you can credit George Washington for actually starting the French Indian War. He became, of course, a very important leader in the House of Burgesses in Virginia against British policies from 1765 to 1775. Of course, remember 1765 is the year of the Stamp Act. So Washington becomes a very vocal, outspoken critic of many British policies leading up to the American Revolution. Of course, we most Americans know Washington as the successful military leader of the Continental Army. He led that ragtag army of militia, misfits, and farmers to pull off one of the most improbable victories in military history. He's also a man who, after the war, was offered many times to be made a king. He was offered to be given the reins of government, and each time he was asked to be a king, he said no. He was actually asked 3 times. He was given the opportunity to have power, and this is something that he rejected. It's arguably probably one of his greatest traits is surrendering the army and turning down monarchy. He was an advocate for strengthening the government between 1784 and 1787. Remember, as we struggled during the AOC, the Articles of Confederation period, it was Washington that insisted that we have a convention and that we need an energetic government and a government that can actually help the fledgling country resolve the problems it was facing. Of course, he served as president of that Constitutional Convention. And of course, from that Constitution, a presidency is going to be built around this man from Virginia. And he's going to serve as president for 8 years, from 1789 to 1797. And of course, the very last title he will ever hold is Commander of U.S. Forces during the Quasi-War in 1798, which was just a title. It was nothing that he actually participated in. It was done out of respect. So again, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of his childhood, his young adulthood. This is a guy, I will say, he's a man of incredible honor. I highly recommend the book Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis. The chapter, The Farewell, really dives into Washington's character. And Washington's character is a topic that we will ultimately address in class. In describing who Washington was, I love this quote right here from Thomas Jefferson. Of course, this is 15 years after Washington was dead, and Jefferson was reminiscing, thinking of his fellow Virginian when he said, quote, "His mind was great and powerful, without being of the very first order. His penetration strong, though not so acute as that of a Newton, Bacon, or Locke. And as far as he saw, no judgment was ever sounder. It was slow in operation, being little aided by invention or imagination, but sure in conclusion." So what Jefferson is saying is, if you were to have met George Washington, where is George Washington's place amongst the founders? He's saying he's no Newton, Bacon, or Locke. I mean, he's not really an intellectual. Right? Now he's a smart man, he's an educated man, but he's not an intellectual. But what George Washington had that really no other founding father had was judgment. That he had great judgment. Jefferson said it was slow in operation, meaning that he thought things through. Right? He's very careful in his decision making. Right? But it always seemed like he made the right decisions. So his decisions were, as it says here, sure in conclusion. Okay. So this next quote: "Parade with me, my brave fellows. We will have them soon." George Washington rallying his troops for the Battle of Princeton. He was capable of inspiring people. Now, he was, in large part, I think, what most people, most of his contemporaries would say about Washington is that he was very quiet, he was very reserved. He was a man of tremendous honor, and he rarely showed emotion. But he, during the war, he did show the ability to rally his troops and to inspire. He has the capacity to inspire. So the next quote comes from one of our outside readings, and it's really fascinating. It's like a little book he used to read when he was a kid about manners, about how one ought to conduct themselves. And it was a book that Washington, as a young boy, copied from as he practiced his handwriting. And he came to really follow this book by the letter. And of course, one of the rules of civility, he says that every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect. So when you're in front of other people, everything you do, the way you hold yourself, the way you behave, your actions, every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect to those that are present. He said, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called a conscience. Like men and women must follow their conscience, the importance of that. So he is a very wise figure. Let's see. Cool. So he's talking about his anti-slavery stance here. Well, I want to go ahead and move ahead. Now, remember, this is the man who during the revolution or after the revolution actually was successful in suppressing a coup, a potential coup of the U.S. government. So this is a man of honestly, he's probably the only man alive at that time who could have that had the character and the gumption to do this. So the Newburgh conspiracy, I know we addressed it last unit, but just remember his role in trying to keep people loyal to the new government. And that's going to be his job as president now, is seeing to it that people are loyal to the next government. Remember, this is the quote he gave before he delivered the address to those officers at Newburgh, where he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." And remember, during that Newburgh address, he nearly brings these men to tears, out of shame for even thinking about staging a coup against the government. So let me move on here. So understanding George Washington as president, Washington basically had 5 primary objectives as president. You got to think about what was the priority. One, he had to establish the credibility of the Constitution, a Constitution that was based on Republican principles. He is now the captain of the government. He's the captain of the team, and he needs to establish credibility of the new government. 2, he needs to gain the loyalty of the citizens for this new government. That's why he's the first president. There is no person in the United States who garnered as much love and loyalty from the American people from all sections than George Washington. And so that the loyalty of the citizenry to this new government was vital if we were going to be successful. 3, use the presidency to represent the entire nation. 4, centralize executive power in the office of the president. He wanted, by the time he was done, he wanted no ambiguity as to who was responsible in the executive branch. So, as we'll learn in a minute, one of the great legacies of George Washington is he is going to establish a number of precedents for the office of the president that future presidents will follow. And number 5, he sought to promote cooperation between the 3 branches of government. He believed that the 3 branches should stay separate in function, but they should be united in goals. They should all serve the interests of the nation. So basically, he created the executive branch from scratch. The precedents that he helped create define the constitutional role of the president even today. He created the tradition of delivering an inaugural address. Nowhere in the Constitution does it state that the president must give an inaugural address. But because he gave an inaugural address at the time of being sworn in, then every future president has done that as well. He delegated the vice president to an insignificant role in the executive branch. So from John Adams is going to be our first vice president, to basically Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is the first vice president really to play a significant, meaningful role in the executive branch. So for well over 150 years, the vice president was it was actually one of the most mundane and useless positions in the executive branch. And it's all because of Washington. Due to his good reputation, the United States Senate did not fight his decisions on executive appointments. The House of Representatives even voted against empowering the Senate to veto presidential dismissals. So his appointments were so solid that the Senate didn't even fight him. He created the cabinet. That's another important precedent. So assisting him in his job, he had 4 secretaries. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Edmund Randolph, Attorney General, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, and Alexander Hamilton, of course, his right-hand man, Secretary of the Treasury. You got 2 Northerners and 2 Southerners, 2 Republicans and 2 Federalists. So it was a bipartisan cabinet. And of course, Jefferson is the party leader for the Republicans. Hamilton is the party leader for the Federalists. So he put the 2 party leaders in his cabinet. So they had some pretty heated cabinet meetings, as you can imagine. Okay. So let's see. So other things he did. I believe that the veto power granted the president should only be used if legislation was deemed unconstitutional. He believed that the president should complete treaties before they send to the Senate. By accepting Alexander Hamilton's plan for the Bank of the United States, he established the use of implied powers under the Elastic Clause. That's we will address that here in a few. And of course, when he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, without Senate approval, he established national security as the sole function of the president. So that's also another very important precedent. He created the idea of the 2 presidents, meaning that the president not only serves as the head of state, but also the symbol of the nation. And I would take note of this one. This is actually one of the most important precedents that he established. He established the tradition of a 2-term presidency. Washington was deathly afraid that if he were to die in office, then the precedent would be that essentially you're president until you die, right? You're president until you die. And he wanted to retire and really create a presidency that is not permanent. It's not a position you hold until death. He received tremendously virulent criticism during his 2nd term. We'll talk about that. His farewell address, this is a note card term. We're going to need to know this. Remains one of history's most articulate statements of principles of republicanism, outlining ideas about the importance of national unity, the value of the Constitution, rule of law, the dangers of political parties, and the virtues that will be necessary for the survival of a Republican society. He was nonpartisan and a symbol of national unity. And that's what made him a great president. He's a Federalist only because he agrees with Hamilton a lot. But he would disagree with you if you he was not partisan. And that's important. He didn't act out of what was best for party. And that was really, really kind of cool. So let me move ahead. So let's look at significant events in Washington's presidency. He's going to be inaugurated in April 1789. Washington was inaugurated in New York City. He's the only president to have been unanimously elected. No other electoral votes were cast for any other person. Sorry about my dog. So they had to have a second. Stop. They had to have a second ballot for vice president, and that's generally at that time the runner-up, the second place finisher would automatically be vice president, and of course the first vice president is John Adams, and so Washington, after being sworn in, is going to appoint people to new offices in the government. And the first order of business was the formation of the Bill of Rights, adopting the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. This is a promise that he made. Remember that the last few states to ratify the Constitution ratified it under the condition that a Bill of Rights would be added to this federal Constitution. And so the Bill of Rights, as you can see here, this is actually one of your outside documents, outside readings for this unit, provided safeguards for American core principles. The first 8 amendments deal with individual liberty and protecting individual liberty from tyrannical government. Amendments number 9 and 10 are basically related to states' rights and about limiting the powers of the federal government and protecting state governments from intrusion of a arbitrary national government. So the Bill of Rights, like I said before, the Anti-Federalists reluctantly agreed to ratify the Constitution under this promise that a Bill of Rights would be added. Like I said, this was Washington's first priority. The Bill of Rights, the U.S. Bill of Rights, was modeled after Virginia's. Looks a lot like Virginia's, and but ultimately, this is one of the first early successes. It's important to understand that amendments. I'm not worried about the amendment process right now, but the second success of the Washington presidency is going to be the Judiciary Act of 1789. According to Article 3 of the Constitution, the Congress was responsible for setting up the federal judiciary. And so under this law, Congress set up a three-tiered system of courts. As you can see here under the first bullet, we've got federal courts, federal appellate courts, and of course, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, right? The U.S. Supreme Court. Today in the United States, there are over 300 federal courts in the United States. There's about a little over a dozen appellate courts. Appellate courts are where decisions on the lower court can be appealed. You can appeal decisions to an appellate court. And of course, the Supreme Court will ultimately become what we call the final arbiter of the Constitution. They're going to eventually solidify for themselves this power of judicial review, which is the power to review laws in figuring whether they are constitutional or not. So important to note about the Supreme Court, the Constitution doesn't limit its size. So we've had as few as 5 justices. We've had as many as 14. And it kind of just ebbs and flows over the course of history. But the Constitution doesn't establish qualifications to be on the court. So you don't even have to be a lawyer to be a Supreme Court justice. You don't even have to have gone to law school or been a judge previously. So the Senate, of course, confirms new judges, all of whom are appointed by the President of the United States. The Federalists, led by George, established a Supreme Court with 5 justices, with John Jay serving as the very first Chief Justice. And the Chief Justice pretty much runs the docket. They helps decide which cases will be heard, what will be the order of business for the court. The law also established the office of Attorney General of the United States, which of course will be part of the President's cabinet. So eventually it'll be Chief Justice John Marshall who will first assert the power of the Supreme Court to review federal laws. So it's important to note that the Founding Fathers in Philadelphia created an office of the President that was powerful. And they did so in an era in which Americans were very sensitive to centralized power in an executive branch and the threat of tyranny on both individual and states' rights. So why did they create a presidency that was so powerful? Well, one, they trusted George Washington with power. They knew that he would not misuse his power and that he would help shape and mold the office and establish those precedents that future presidents would follow. 2, and I think more importantly, the nation in the 1790s was in really big trouble. I mean, economically, in terms of national security, the country needed a strong leader that was cloaked in immense power to help us get through the emergency, right? To get emergency, and of course, we needed a commander-in-chief. We needed someone in charge of the army, of the armed services. And George Washington, no doubt, it was the man, was the right man at the right time to be the first commander-in-chief of the military. So again, looking at how did George Washington shape the presidency? First of all, he made the office very formal in nature, meaning you got to dress nice, you travel nice, you eat nice. So he's kind of fancy. He's kind of fancy. Number two, the president is the highest ranking executive officer in the United States. There's no governor, there's no mayor, there's no other elected executive officer in the United States that makes more money than or that outranks the president of the United States. He's the highest ranking executive in the United States. There's a story where the president went to Boston to visit, and he wanted to see the governor. The governor of Massachusetts at the time was John Hancock. And John Hancock insisted that the president come see him. And the president said, no, it doesn't work that way. I said, if John Hancock wants to meet, he's got to come see me. So the president is the lead duck when it comes to executive officers in the United States. President is the highest paid official in the government. The White House, he established the White House as the people's house. The White House does not belong to the president. It belongs to the American people. And he established that idea. We talked about the cabinet, his farewell address, and of course, serving 2 terms. Now, prominent in the Washington presidency was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, after the Revolution, becomes the leader of the Federalist Party. He's the leader. Okay, so he's not president, but he's the leader of the party. He's the role of Hamilton in Washington's presidency is very pronounced and distinguished. Hamilton will serve by George Washington's side, not only throughout his, during the war and during the AOC period, during the critical period, but Hamilton will be by Washington's side all the way until George Washington's death in 1799. And though Washington was not a partisan figure, he normally sided with Hamilton's policies. And that's why we call Washington a Federalist. Not because he's partisan, not because he sees himself as a member of a political party, but just simply because he agreed very frequently with whatever Hamilton thought was good, especially his economic policies. So what Hamilton sought to do as not only party leader, but also Secretary of the Treasury, he sought to use the newly acquired powers of the national government through the Constitution of the United States to really cement itself. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which we call the Elastic Clause, will be invoked by Hamilton to do what is, quote, necessary and proper in order to address the economic crisis that the new republic was facing in the 1790s. So this necessary and proper clause is going to allow for a major expansion in the powers of government. So let's talk about, okay. Hamilton.
How does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of a trading charter.
And every day while slaves were being slaughtered and carted away across the waves, he struggled and kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, or barter.
Then a hurricane came, devastation reigned on man. He saw his future dripping down the drain. The pencil to his temple connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Well, the word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world's gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things I haven't done. Just you wait, just you wait.
When he was 10, his father stripped on a vet, bedridden. 2 years later, see Alex and his mother bedridden, half dead, sitting in their own sick, the scent thick.
Alex got better, but his mother moving with a cousin, my cousin committed suicide. Left him with nothing but ruined pride. Something new inside a voice saying, Alex, you gotta think for yourself. He started retreating and reading every treatise on the shelf. There would have been nothing left to do for someone less astute. He would have been dead, destitute, without a cent or restitution. Started working, packing for his late mother's landlord, trading sugar cane and rum and all the things he can't afford to sell him all. Every book he can get his hands on, planning for the future. See him now with his hands on the bow of the ship, heading for a new land. In New York, you can be a new man. 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 Just you wait. Alexander Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. You're waiting in the wings for you, waiting in the wings. You never back down, you never learn to take your time. Oh, Alexander Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. America sings for you. But they know what you overcame. But they know you wrote the game. Oh, you'll never be the same. Oh, ship is in the harbor now. See if you can spot him. Another immigrant coming up from the bottom. His enemies destroyed his wreck. America forgot him. We fought with him. Me, I died for him. Me, I trusted him.
Me, I love him.
And me, I'm the damn fool that shot him.
There's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait.
What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton.
Awesome! What a great way to to get teenagers to fall in love with our founding fathers. I love what Miranda did with this play, with this theatrical production, really telling the story of a very influential founder. As much as I have spent singing the praises of Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton equally balances him out. He's just as valuable. What Hamilton did is he put the United States on a firm foundation of economic success. 1776, two major documents were created that really help signify who and what the United States is. The first, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. The second is what was called Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, which is where he essentially invented capitalism. And so Hamilton is, whereas Jefferson is going to bring democracy and freedom to the United States, Hamilton's going to bring the free market to bear. He's going to bring capitalism to bear. But really, the goal is through sending 3 reports to Congress. He's going to try to help. He's to create a plan to pull the United States out of its depression. And so his economic program we know affectionately as BFAT. It's an acronym. So we will address that here on the next slide. But these first report on public credit, the second report on public credit, and the report on manufacturers, these are essentially reports that he sent to Congress, where he's suggesting that Congress pass certain legislation aimed at improving the economy. The goal of Hamilton's economic program was, one, we got to pay off our debts, got to pay off the foreign debts, all right, 12 million worth. Pay off the Continental Congress's debts, the $42 million that were owed to domestic creditors, honor the war bonds that were sold by Congress during the war, and come up with a plan to save the states. Remember, there were states that were going into debt and going bankrupt. You can't have 6 bankrupt states. And it was very important for us to establish credit, so other nations would lend us money so that we can trade. So and so that's really the goal, the ultimate goal of the Hamilton program. At the time, the United States only had two basic ways to raise money: sell land, which was slow and inhibited by speculators and Indians, and of course, tariffs, which are essentially taxes on imports and excise taxes. In 1790, we also only had three banks. So we didn't have much of a banking system that rivaled that of the British model. So Hamilton is going to make this a significant priority. You talk about building that foundation of the United States economy. We've got to have a banking system. We've got to have a way to raise revenue, and we got to find a way to deal with our debt issue and our credit issue. The fact is, we didn't have a whole lot of credit. So BFAT, this is BFAT right here, Bank of the United States, excise taxes, funding at par, assumption of state debts, and tariff, putting taxes on imports. This is his 5-point plan. We're going to start off first with the Bank of the United States, which is often been called the world's first stimulus package. It was what he needed Congress to do was to issue a charter to create and build this institution, this Bank of the United States. It would be a monopoly. It would have no competitors. It would be a private bank. It would not actually be connected to the government. It would be a private bank, but it would house all federal tax receipts, gold, and currency. It would create branch banks in every major city in the country. It would print a dollar. It would actually create currency, a unified dollar, and it would help build confidence in that dollar, where people felt like it was actually worth something. After printing banknotes, they would circulate. So we're talking about national banknotes. We're talking about currency. We're talking about money. The Bank of the United States, and I tell you, this is a big function. This is really what Hamilton wanted to see, is that once the bank became prosperous, it would then be able to loan money to businesses in order to stimulate economic activity. People could take loans from the bank in order to open new businesses, start new economic enterprises, and the like. The bank would also help create capital, and the big, and according to Hamilton, and this is big, number 7. I want you to really focus on 7 here. He felt like the bank was constitutional, that it did not violate the Constitution, because under Article 1, Section 8, the elastic clause, remember that's the necessary and proper clause. He said that the Congress of the United States can pass laws that are necessary and proper. They can pass laws that are necessary and proper, and he believes that a bank is both necessary and proper in order for the United States to prosper. The problem he saw, now Jefferson became an outspoken critic of the bank, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But Jefferson put his faith in state banks, not federal banks, not national banks, but state banks. And you can see on the right-hand side the problem that Hamilton had with state banks. So let's move on to George Washington. He originally opposed the bank. He thought that the bank was unconstitutional, but Hamilton convinced him that because really you have what's called, and this is a note card term, it's loose construction of the Constitution versus strict construction. Strict construction means that government can only do what the Constitution specifically lists, right? And nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically say that the government can build a bank, right? So that's Jefferson's point of view. Jefferson is what we call a strict constructionist. He believed that we can only follow the Constitution literally. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that we can build a bank. And Jefferson, or it's not Jefferson, but Washington originally believed this to be true. He thought the bank was unconstitutional because nowhere in the Constitution did it give the government the power to charter a new bank. But Hamilton pointed out, if you look at this first bullet, that the government in 1789 passed a law building lighthouses. Well, where in the Constitution does it give the government the power to build lighthouses? And the answer is no, it's not there. So that's what Hamilton said to him. He says, if we can build lighthouses, then we can build banks. There's really no difference. So George Washington eventually reluctantly signed the bill into law, and the bank charter would last for 20 years. And so think about it. So every 20 years, that bank would have to be reapproved by Congress. Okay, we're a Congress. So in his report on manufacturers, Hamilton argued that the United States is a colony to the rest of the world. Our economy was not balanced, and we must be like Europe. So he says we can't be a nation of farmers. 90% of Americans are farmers, but he says we have to be a lot like Europe. We have to be able to manufacture things. We have to be able to build things. We got to have industries. We got to be able, so we can't just continually depend on other countries to provide us the things we need when we should be able to provide those things for ourselves. So let's see. So arguments against the bank. So opposition against the bank were spearheaded by both Jefferson and Madison. The bank actually was technically the first constitutional crisis in history. The big question is the national bank necessary and proper? And Jefferson had faith that state-run banks, and he feared the consolidation of power into a strong central bank. So Hamilton's bank kind of reminded him of the British banks that the king would use, during prior to the Revolution. So here are the arguments against the bank. I've got 7 major ones. Interestingly enough, these will be many of the same arguments that Andrew Jackson is going to have 20 years or so down the road as the bank is going to be rechartered. Number one argument why the bank was that Jefferson was against the bank is that he believed it was unconstitutional. The Constitution does not grant the national government the power to charter a new bank. This is a state power. Only states can build banks. 2, and this is important, Jefferson foresaw the bank becoming a moneyed tyrant, controlled by elite people, wealthy people, only serving the narrow interests of very elitist people. He saw the bank as a potential threat to the liberties of average Americans, i.e. farmers, whose wealth is not tied up in paper and, like currency and bonds and stuff, but rather whose wealth is tied up in land and slaves. He didn't like the fact that the bank was privately owned. So the federal government only had 2 seats on the board. It wasn't a government bank, and he didn't trust the fact that it was not a government bank. Said the bank would serve the urban industrials interests, okay, and not the farmers. And Jefferson is he represents the rural farming regions in the country. He said the bank had too much British influence, too much foreign investment. Jefferson did not trust those that operated the bank. He thought the men who operated the bank were motivated by self-interest and greed and really did not look out for all Americans. And he didn't like the bank because state banks would have a very difficult time to compete against the power of a national bank. So Hamilton, his arguments in favoring the bank, he said, quote, a restrictive interpretation of the word necessary is also contrary to the sound maxim of construction, namely that the powers contained in a constitution ought to be construed liberally in advancement of the public good. So he says, as we read the Constitution, we have to be liberal in the way that we interpret the Constitution. So that word necessary, again, is referring to Article 1, Section 8 of the elastic clause in the Constitution. Okay, so the means by which national exigencies are to be provided for national prosperity promoted are of such an infinite variety, extent, and complexity that there must be of necessity a great latitude of choice in the selection and application of these means. Hence, the necessity of exercising the authorities entrusted to a government on the principle of liberal construction. So he's talking about loose construction, right? We got to be able to view the Constitution in a much wider, liberal, loose scope. Said if the end, meaning the purpose of the law, if the purpose of the law be clearly comprehended with any specific powers, and if the measure have an obvious relation to the end, and it's not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may be safely deemed to come within the compass of the national authority. So basically he says that only if the Constitution strictly forbids something can the government not do something. But if it doesn't forbid an action, then it's covered under the necessary and proper clause. Jefferson responded, he said, I consider the foundation of the Constitution that, quote, all powers not delegated to the United States nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states or to the people. So nowhere in the Constitution does it give the government the power to charter a bank. So therefore, as it says here, all powers not delegated to the United States or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states. So that's the 10th Amendment. So according to the 10th Amendment, Jefferson believes that only state governments can build banks. The national government cannot. He goes on to say, to take a single step beyond the boundaries that are specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. So he's saying that there's a great deal of danger in necessary and proper, right? Necessary and proper is that if we allow the necessary and proper, basically anything can be done by government. Anything done by government can be deemed necessary and proper. And he fears that if necessary and proper, if this, what we call this, the Lassett Clause, if it's allowed to charter a bank, then think about what else is the government going to do. What else are they going to build? What other actions is it going to sanction? So remember, we have what are called delegated powers in the Constitution. And delegated powers are powers that are specifically assigned to a particular branch of government. Okay, so for example, the power of veto is a delegated power to the president. The power to declare war is a delegated power to the House of Representatives. So he says that essentially, unless a power is delegated, that the power of the branches, the power of these departments are essentially already delegated. And if it's not delegated, then it's got to be retained by the states. Okay. So the argument between Hamilton and Jefferson over the bank really boiled down to one question. Was it constitutional? And unfortunately for Jefferson and the Republicans, they lost the argument in Congress and the bill passed in 1791. And then Jefferson failed to convince George Washington not to sign the bill. Okay. In an effort for time, this is an exchange on the HBO miniseries, John Adams, an exchange between Hamilton and Jefferson on the bank. So I recommend you watch that at home. Great big picture question here. Actually, on my Google site at the very bottom, there's a chart showing a side-by-side comparison between Hamilton and Jefferson. And I want you to think about, to what extent is the United States today Hamiltonian or Jeffersonian, both politically, socially, and economically? Okay. So the next one, and this after assumption, I think I'm going to cut it off, and this will be the end of part one. But central to the economic recovery of the country, Hamilton sought to try to boost America's credit rating. All right, remember we had no credit. We came out of the revolution. The economy is destroyed, and no one will lend us money. And people won't lend us money because they don't think we will be able to pay them back. So the way you build credit is you have to incur a debt. And then you have to show the ability to pay on that debt. Now, the larger the debt and the ability to pay on that debt will actually improve the credit rating of the United States. So Hamilton, if you look at this last bullet, it says Hamilton sought to improve the nation's credit by proposing a plan to enlarge the nation's debt by assuming all state debts. By demonstrating the ability to pay on a larger debt, the nation's credit rating would improve. In Hamilton's mind, this would greatly benefit America's sluggish trade with Europe. So Madison, the leader of the House, James Madison's in the House of Representatives, he opposed the assumption plan. Okay? And the reason why he opposed the assumption is that if the national government were to essentially assume the debts of the states, that means the national government is actually going to pay it off. They're going to pay off the debts of the states. It would give the federal government greater authority over the states. And they're going to pay off that debt, by the way, through the national bank. So it would make that national bank, which is, again, not very well liked by Jefferson and Madison, it would make that bank even more powerful. Okay, the northern states, which of course represent the financial capital of the United States, would grow in power over the agrarian states. All right, so the agrarian states, of course, are these farming states. So essentially, Madison's main argument is that Virginia, his home state, in addition to other states, had basically already exhausted their domestic and foreign debts. They had already paid off their debts. Why should they now have to pay off other states who have yet to exhaust their debts? So eventually, this issue, and by the way, James Madison told Hamilton, we're not even going to consider it. We're not going to even consider it. We're not even going to bring it up in Congress. Your assumption plan is essentially dead on arrival. So what happens next is, of course, Hamilton is beside himself and he's depressed about this. And they have a compromise. They actually have a dinner. Madison and Hamilton get together over dinner at Jefferson's place. Jefferson hosts a dinner, and over dinner, they worked out a compromise. Madison agreed, and it's called the Compromise of 1790. Madison agreed that he would allow a vote in Congress on Hamilton's assumption plan. And Madison promised that he would not go to the floor and speak either for or against the assumption plan. Okay? In exchange for this, Hamilton would have agreed to convince Washington to shift the capital from the north, which at the time was in New York City, to the south. And of course, if you're from Virginia, if you're Madison and Jefferson, having the capital a little bit closer to home is pretty convenient. Through much debate, both Maryland and Virginia ceded land to the federal government for the establishment of a new capital, D.C., the District of Columbia, and George Washington selected the final site on the banks of the Potomac River, just miles from his Mount Vernon estate. So the assumption plan will pass Congress. Hamilton gets his plan. All right, the debts are assumed. And of course, the South, what they get is they get the capital. They get the capital moved. So funding at par. I'm not really worried so much about this one for you guys. This is basically a plan for that. This is a way for Hamilton to get rid of a lot of debt, a lot of federal debt that we had on our books by ending what was called speculation in war bonds that were sold during the American Revolution. And so only Americans who had actually purchased war bonds in their name were allowed to redeem them. But if you had someone else's war bonds and the bonds were in someone else's name, you weren't allowed to sell those bonds. So funding it part, just understand it was a goal. It was a way for Hamilton to really unload a lot of millions of dollars of debt that the government was owed. So then the next, we've got the excise taxes. Now that we've got a new constitution, Hamilton is going to use this power to raise revenue, right? We need revenue, we need money. And so the E in BFAT is excise taxes, okay? So a source of government revenue is needed to pay the respectable amount due to the previous bondholders. Got to raise money for that by December 1790. Hamilton believed that import duties, which were the government's primary source of revenue, had been raised basically as high as they could go. So tariffs were about as high as they can go. Import duties about as high as they can go. So therefore, he promoted the passage of a tax on distilled spirits. Yes, the whiskey tax. This was the first ever tax levied by the national government on a domestic product, not a foreign product, a domestic product. And because whiskey was by far the most popular distilled beverage in 17th century America, the excise became known as the whiskey tax. Now, farmers absolutely lost their minds over this tax. First of all, they thought this tax was targeted right at them. Frontiersmen were already angry at the government for not providing protection from Indian raids. Many of these poor farmers, these frontiersmen, weren't able to vote yet. So think about that revolution mantra, no taxation without representation. They felt like poor farmers really weren't represented in government. So you can't really tax us because we really don't have a voice. They also opposed the whiskey tax because they felt that distillers in the East took advantage of tax breaks, which is not true, but that's what they thought. The tax, of course, would make Western distillers less competitive with Eastern distillers. So farmers, understand that farmers make whiskey. Okay, this is income for farmers. And whiskey, by the way, is considered to be a poor man's drink. So it kind of looks like a tax on the poor. It's a tax on farmers. And those are Jefferson's people. So Hamilton, on the right-hand side of the page, Hamilton thought it was completely appropriate. He said tariffs and import duties were raised to the max. We're taxing an item that is not, like, you don't need it to survive. Whiskey, drinking alcohol is a sin. It's basically, it amounts to what we call a luxury tax on basically a non-essential item. He says that under the Constitution, the central government has the power to tax. The tax is completely legal and constitutional. And that they were taxing not just whiskey, but all distilleries, okay? Not just whiskey distilleries, that all people were being taxed equally. Well, farmers came out and they revolted. In the summer of 1794, there's a big revolt that happens in Pennsylvania. Farmers in Western Pennsylvania, not wanting to pay the federal tax on whiskey, marched on to Philadelphia. So Hamilton didn't have any regard towards these protests. He saw these people as rebel rousers, anti-federalists. These are people who really didn't like the Constitution in the first place. These are Jefferson's people. In response to the tax, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson resigned from the cabinet in protest of this tax. And what the whiskey tax revealed to the Jeffersonians is what they had always believed, that Hamilton just simply had a tremendous disdain for common folks, for farmers. So here's a very famous cartoon, the exciseman. He's like the tax collector. Okay. Kind of fun to read. So the Whiskey Boys revolted against the tax by destroying property, tar and feathering excisemen, violently harassing government officials, and Hamilton supporters throughout Pennsylvania. Protesters even invoked calls for secession as a tri-state militia was being formed in response to the violence. President Washington, with a force of 15,000 federal troops, was able to, quote, convince these people and the world of the moderation and firmness of the new federal government. Hamilton finished the military action as George Washington only participated a part of the way. He only made it to Maryland, and he said, okay, Hamilton, you take over. The tax would be repealed shortly after the rebellion. So the Whiskey Rebellion revealed that the new government could suppress a Shays type of rebellion. Remember Shays Rebellion? So that is awesome. Jeffersonians gained sympathy and increased support from ordinary farmers. And there's a famous image of George Washington personally leading the troops into Pennsylvania. And basically, once the army marched into Pennsylvania, the farmers just threw down their weapons and went home. There was no bloodshed, none of that stuff. And the last part of BFAT are tariffs, the taxes on imports. And so he imposes an 8% tariff on imports. This became the first ever revenue bearing, I misspelled that, tariff in American history. Tariffs generally exist not just to generate revenue for the government, but to also help make domestic-made products cheaper from foreign competition. So here's a link showing the differences between Jefferson and Hamilton. So you have a copy of this PowerPoint. It's on the Google Classroom and my Google site. So I highly recommend that you download this and get a copy. There's another video talking about the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson. Again, these are the two party leaders. The Hamiltonian period, or the Federalist era, is really a story about these two men and their rivalry. They have different competing visions for the country, and so you're going to need to be familiar with that. So let's see. And really, I said they're the head of the two-party system. So the one issue that united both Federalist era presidents was the concern of parties. Both Washington and Adams believed that partisan factions posed a huge danger to the health of the republic. But unfortunately, during the 1790s, the party system did galvanize around Hamilton and his followers, the Federalists, and Jefferson, James Madison, and their followers, called the Republicans. So, I think these are pretty good quotes from some important party leaders in their respective parties. I like Jefferson's here. He says the end of democracy and the defeat of the American Revolution will occur when government falls into the hands of lending institutions and moneyed corporations. So if Jefferson were alive today, he would not like Wall Street. He would not like the big banks. He would not like Amazon or Google or these big, massive corporations. It goes on to say the cornerstone of democracy rests on the foundation of an educated electorate. And he wanted farmers to be educated. There's no doubt about that. He's a man of the farmer. John Jay said those that run the country ought to own it. Those that supposed to be owned. Those that own the country ought to run it. The rich, the powerful, the elite. So those are the Hamiltonians. Hamilton says it's not tyranny we desire. It's just a limited federal government. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. This will be the end of part one. So get ready for part two. Thank you.